2024 was an amazing reading year, full of classic books, and it really reflects in my 2024 list of top 10 books of the year, which I'm going to be sharing with you right now. Hello friends, and welcome to my channel. My name is Haley and I am a Christian wife, homeschooling mother of 3, out to redeem my very own literary education. And in order to do that, I have been reading a ton of classic books, and it really is no surprise that almost all of my top 10 books of 2024 were classics. I mean, they're classics for a reason, right? So without further ado, let's just dive right in. So in 2024, I had 2 goals. I had a male author of the year and a female author of the year, in which I wanted to read as many of their works as possible. And my male author of the year was C.S. Lewis, and my female author of the year was Jane Austen. And honestly, those 2 authors alone could make up my entire top 10 list, but that wouldn't be very much fun. So I limited myself to choosing 1 book from each of the books that I read. And I recently did a video wrapping up all the C.S. Lewis books I read in 2024, so you can check that out. And I'm going to be having a Jane Austen video come out soon about her books. So we'll just get into my favorites. My favorite C.S. Lewis book of the year was C.S. Lewis's An Experiment in Criticism. This one was really hard to choose because I loved all of his works. But I thought to myself, what is the one C.S. Lewis book I already can't wait to reread? And it was An Experiment in Criticism. In this book, he talks about what makes a good book, what makes a good reader, and it was incredibly convicting to me. I realized I fell into some traps that didn't make me such a great reader, but I also could relate to so many things in here that did make me feel like I was a decent reader. But this book was convicting in my literary life, and it was just a really good read if you love books and you want to read the great books. I think this was really kind of his defense against this rise of literary criticism. And a lot of the literary critics seemed to really enjoy critiquing books, but didn't really seem to love reading books. And that is the point. And this book had so many great quotes that I put in my commonplace book. I mean, I just highlighted the fire out of the thing and loved it so much. I also read this alongside of the Literary Life podcast, which has become one of my favorite reading podcasts. And it was really fun to listen to them and read this at the same time. So yeah, this one makes one of the top of the list for my top 10 of last year. And these books aren't in any particular order, just they're all the same. I love them all. I can't choose. But my favorite Jane Austen book, which was a surprise to me because it was the one that I knew the least about, was Mansfield Park. Now, I should disclaim that Pride and Prejudice is, of course, a favorite. It's always been one of my favorite books, and so I don't really feel like it's fair to include it in this list. I did read it last year, but it's one of my favorite books of all time, so I didn't want to put it on this list just kind of for obvious reasons. It just wouldn't be very fun if I chose that one. But this is my other favorite Jane Austen book, and that's Mansfield Park. And in this one, we follow a heroine that is so unlike any of the other heroines that I've ever read about that I found her incredibly endearing. We follow Fanny Price, who is an incredibly introverted, shy, kind of sickly character, but incredibly virtuous and good-hearted. She is kind of from a poor family, and her aunt and uncle adopt her to kind of help their sister out a little bit as charity, and she is raised up amongst the sons and daughters of her aunt and uncle. So she's getting a better education and better opportunity by living with them at Mansfield Park. However, because of her birth, she's always placed to the side as less than them. And she is in love with someone in here who just doesn't see her for what she's really worth. And it kind of breaks my heart throughout it. But it has a happy ending, as all Jane Austen books do, and I just really loved it. I thought it was fun to read about a character that was actually shy and would literally run away. Like, there were points in this book where the other characters were like, where is Fanny? And as the reader, you can kind of forget about her. You're like, oh, wait, yeah, where is she? Because there are other characters in here that really kind of take the lead. There's a sibling set that's kind of the villains of the story, and their characters are interesting. You love to hate them. But this is another book that I read alongside the Literary Life podcast, and I just had a blast reading it, and I want to read it again. So I know this isn't one of Jane Austen's most popular works. In fact, I think it's one of her least popular, but I found it to be a favorite, so I would still recommend you highly give it a try. And the next book that I have on this list, which reminds me of Jane Austen's writing, so if you love Jane Austen and you haven't read this one, you might want to consider it this spring, and that is The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. I was blown away by how much I loved this book. I wasn't expecting it. This book follows a set of different women. It starts with Lottie, who is kind of this quirky character who really feels misplaced in the world. She feels like her husband doesn't really value her. She doesn't feel like she has anything to contribute, and she's just ready to get away. And so she sees this ad in the paper where you can rent this castle out for like a month, but she's kind of poor and doesn't have a lot of money, so she needs to band together a group of women with her in order to be able to rent out this castle. And all of the women are incredibly different. I feel like Elizabeth von Arnim captures the quirks in human nature and in her characters in the same way that Jane Austen does, which is why I think this kind of reminded me of a Jane Austen book, but it's still its own book. But that's one of the reasons why I loved it. All four of the women are different. I mean, completely different, and they all have their reasons for coming to this castle. But the book is really about how beauty can kind of re-enliven and reawaken your soul, which in turn can just change your life or your marriage or a lot of the things. So all of the women come to this castle and they leave with something really valuable at the end. It was so heartwarming. I think it's a perfect book to read in April because it's the Enchanted April. And again, which is starting to be a theme, I realized that I also read this alongside of the Literary Life podcast, and it felt like a book club. It was fun to read this book with the podcast and follow along with the episodes. There's always like a few chapters in each episode, so you can kind of work through it slowly, but that was really fun, and I loved this book. And not only does this book make my top 10 of 2024, it makes like my top 5 books of all time. So I'm going to be rereading this April because I loved it that much, and I highly recommend it to you. And the next book on my list took me 6 months to read, but it was worth every second, and that is Paradise Lost by John Milton. This is an epic poem that is a retelling of the story of Genesis through points of view of Satan and Adam and Eve, and it was so fascinating. You know, we kind of know from the book of Genesis, if you're a Christian, how God created the world. We know kind of what happened to Adam and Eve. We know what happened to Satan, but we don't know their inner thoughts and their inner motivations. What does Satan think about being kicked out of heaven? Why did he come after Adam and Eve? What were Adam and Eve's motivations to kind of rebel against God? What happened there? What do they think about creation? And just, I loved the ideas that he explored in here because it made me, as a Christian, feel a real kinship to Adam and Eve. It gave me a little more empathy. I think as Christians, we blame them for, sin and everything. But this made them more relatable and more human. And it's an epic poem, so it's told absolutely beautifully. But if you're intimidated by picking up a book like this, because like I said, this took me 6 months to read it. I just did a few pages at a time as I felt called and picked it up. But I did read a preface to Paradise Lost written by C.S. Lewis, and he kind of explores what is an epic poem, and then he goes through some of the ideas in here, like the characters of Satan and Adam and Eve and the angels, and what Milton was trying to do with this epic poem and what he was not trying to do. It also felt like a defense of the book against its critics, but it helped me go into it with a better idea of what I was reading and what I was going into. So this was definitely worth the read. It's a book that was difficult kind of at the time, but outside of reading it, it's a book I think about the most. Like if I'm just hanging out outside with my kids and my mind is wandering, I will think of scenes in this book, and that's really profound. So this book is going to stick with me, and I'll probably pick it up again in a few years and just work through it slowly again. It was that good. And then the next book I read is another long book, but worth the read. And that is Middlemarch by George Elliot, which is an absolute beast of a book. And it's also a really kind of slow book, but I loved it so much. And the actual subtitle of the book is a study in provincial life. So Middlemarch is the name of the small town where it takes place. And it follows all of the cast of characters that live within this town. They each kind of have their own storylines, but they also intertwine throughout the book and later in the book. You have characters who meet, you have characters who never meet. But I would also say that this is a book about marriage. And I would highly recommend it to anyone who not only is married, but wants to get married, because in some ways I think it's maybe a cautionary tale. In other ways, I think it's about finding true happiness in your marriage and knowing who you are and what you want before you go into a marriage. So I loved it for that. It's a book that doesn't have a lot of big, exciting action and plot lines. It's slow, but it's so character driven. I was just really invested in these people's lives. And what made this book fascinating to me was George Eliot, also known as Marianne Evans, her ability to capture human thought and human nature and human life so well and realistically. These characters were written that they just feel so real, and I loved them. You get all types of characters in this book, and I loved it. If you read it, my favorite, or if you have read it, my favorite character is Mary Garth. And I love her for all kinds of reasons, but she is kind of lowly. She's not exactly the most beautiful woman in the world, but she is of quick wit. She knows right from wrong, and she knows what she wants in life, even when she's in love, and it all works out. But this one is a beast. I wouldn't actually recommend this one to everybody because it's slow paced. So if you're someone who has to have a lot of action in a book, I don't know how much you would love it. But if you like slower books, if you are invested in character driven stories, then I would highly recommend Middlemarch to you. The next book I read, I absolutely loved, specifically as a homeschool mother, and that was Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. And this is the sequel to, of course, Little Women. And in Little Men, we follow Jo March, who is now Mrs. Jo Bear, and her husband at their home, which is also a school for boys. This story was so charming, and I loved to see Jo in that role of a mother and a teacher, and I had so much parental advice from this book that I want to take. I want to be a mother like Jo March. I want to have my kids respect me in the way that they do the Bears, the husband and wife in this book. And all of the little childhood antics, because you kind of read the book from the perspective of all of the little men, the young boys, was so charming and endearing, and it was just a beautiful story to watch them grow and to watch the effect of true, loving parents in a good Christian home and a good nurturing environment, what it can do to rambunctious boys and even young girls. There were 2 young girls in this book as well that I loved, but this was such a fun story, and it's one that I would recommend to anyone. You don't have to be a mother to like it. You don't have to be a homeschool mother to like it, but if you also happen to be those 2 things, I think you'll really, really love it. So this was a favorite. And this next book may be one of my favorites of the year just because it delivered everything I wanted and expected from it. And that is The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. And this is I would actually say a continuation of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, but this is the Mary Bennet story, which if you've ever read Pride and Prejudice or seen the movie and you wanted more for Mary Bennet, this is it. If you want to know why Mary Bennet and Mr. Collins didn't end up together, you think they should have, if you think Mary Bennet deserved more, this is that book. This is her story, and I loved it. I thought that Janice Hadlow captured the spirit of a Jane Austen story so well. Now, I'll say I think she stretched some characters' personalities just a little bit, but I think it helped further develop Mary's story. Like Mrs. Bennet was, I would say, a bit more villainous and mean-spirited in this book. I think that Charlotte Lucas was a little bit colder and meaner in this book, but I understand why Janice Hadlow did that in order to further Mary's story. But the first few chapters of the book, you're actually seeing Mary in real time in the story of Pride and Prejudice. So when Mr. Collins comes, and then whenever she has that really infamous piano playing scene where they carry her off because she's singing and she's embarrassed the whole family, you get to see all of that through her eyes. But then she embarks on her own journey with her aunt and uncle Gardner and gets her own love story that I just loved. If you are an academic person, you'll love this because Mary is that way. But then she starts to dive into poetry, and it kind of awakens her soul to beauty and possibility, and she just blossoms in this book like a true Jane Austen heroine, and I loved it. It's long, but to me it was worth every second. I'm learning that I really love long books, especially when I get invested in a character, and I've always wanted more from Mary Bennet, and this was it. So if you feel the same way about her and you think she deserves more, this is that more. I loved it. One of my absolute favorite books of the year, and probably favorite books of all time. That's how much it delivered for me. And I think every time I reread Pride and Prejudice, I'm going to be rereading this one right afterwards. It was that good. And the next book I have, of course, another classic, that is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I've had this book on my shelf for years, and I've just avoided it because I thought that the form that the story was told in was weird and I didn't know how I would like it. That turned out to be true, but I loved it. I actually read this book twice because when I finished it the first time, I was just kind of shell-shocked. It's not what I expected. I went into Wuthering Heights supposing it was a love story. I mean, look at the cover. You assume it's going to be a love story. You always hear about Kathy and Heathcliff. But no, this is an intense book about revenge, and all of the characters are kind of evil and bad, but the story is so gripping that you can't help but just be sucked into it. And now that I've read it twice, I can say that I loved it. I didn't know at first because I just couldn't articulate my feelings, but I did really, really love it. Now, none of the characters are necessarily ones that I root for or care for, but I was invested in what was going on in their lives and in this story. And I did a whole spoiler-free review and a spoilery book review on Wuthering Heights, which you can find on my channel, because I had so many thoughts about it. But it's a book I could read again, and again, not only for its compelling story, but for its atmosphere. This book is perfect for fall or October or even winter just because of the way that the setting is described. Wuthering Heights and the wind and the cold and the moors. It was wonderful, beautifully written, and one of my favorites, and certainly deserves to be in the top 10 of 2024. And the next book I read is another atmospheric classic, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is probably my most surprising read of 2024. I picked this one up in October just wanting a horror science fiction classic for October. And I was not expecting to be deeply emotionally moved by this book. It was so poetic and profound and emotionally moving. I wasn't ready for that. I was expecting Frankenstein to be this exciting story, and in a lot of ways it was, but to me it was almost more emotionally compelling. I really at times felt sad for the monster. Frankenstein is actually the name of the doctor, Dr. Frankenstein, and the monster himself is never named, but I was wrestling with, do I feel sorry for him or do I not? And this book just answered or made you ask a lot of questions about what is just, what is right, what is wrong, and then what can it do when your pursuit of passions, your pursuit of a dream just goes too far, because it can go too far. And it did in this book, and it was great. So this one shocked me. This is my most shocking read of 2024, but also one of my favorites. I would read it again. I would recommend it to anyone. Mary Shelley is a poet in her own right and married to Percy Shelley, the famous romantic poet of this time. But she's a poet in her own right, and there's some poetry in here as well. And I loved it. So, would highly recommend Frankenstein for you this fall. And last but certainly not least, now this one isn't a classic, but to me, I think it's going to be considered a modern classic. So 100 years from now, I think this is one of those books that's going to stand the test of time and people are still going to be reading it. You've probably heard of it. But that is the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Marianne Shaffer and Annie Barrows. This book was just so charming and delightful and fun, but still being incredibly profound and moving. So this book is told through a series of letters from a main character named Juliet Ashton, who stumbles upon the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. She is writing an article for the New York Times about the German occupation, and she discovers this society of very quirky and unique readers, and they're all writing her letters to tell them about their time on the island of Guernsey during the German occupation. And so not only did I learn a lot historically about that time period, but also I was just charmed by all of the literary references and the wit and the humor and the love story in this book. I just loved it. And I read this book whenever we went on a camping trip, and this is the perfect book for something like that. If you're going on vacation or you just want a light, quick read, I think because this was told in the form of letters that it makes it perfect for that, because it was very quick. But I was very invested into all of these characters, and then of course the overall storyline of what's going to happen with our heroine as well. So I loved it. I'm so glad I finally picked this one up. I've heard about it for a long time. It's popular, you've probably read it, but it was certainly worth the read and makes it on my top 10 of 2024 book list. So that is my top 10 reads of 2024. What a wonderful reading year. I am so excited for the year ahead. I've definitely discovered that there are just no books that can really match the classics. So I've become someone who mainly reads classic books. So you're going to find that a lot on all of my lists from now on, because actually a quote from the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society was, "Reading good books ruins you for reading bad ones." And now that I am a classic book reader, it's going to be hard to go back. It just really is. So I hope your 2025 is full of wonderful reads. Please share with me in the comments below what your favorite books in 2024 were and what books you think that I should add to my list in 2025. I will see you next time. Happy reading, friends.